There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to small towns. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of routine, of lives so familiar they have stopped making noise. In 1963, Derinkuyu was exactly that kind of town. A modest settlement in the heart of Cappadocia, Turkey, draped across a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Strange volcanic rock formations rose from the earth like frozen giants. The soil was soft, almost dreamlike in texture. The sky above it was vast and indifferent, and beneath it all, something waited. The man had no idea, of course. Nobody ever does in stories like this. He was thinking about storage space, perhaps a little more room for supplies, maybe a cooler corner to keep things through the summer heat. Ordinary thoughts for an ordinary Tuesday. He descended into his basement the way people have descended into basements for centuries, reluctantly, with a lamp and with the low-grade suspicion that something would need to be moved before anything useful could happen. He had a hammer. He had a wall. The wall, it seemed, needed to come down. He swung. The impact rang through the room the way it always does, that solid, satisfying crack of iron meeting stone. But then something unexpected happened. The wall did not resist. It gave, not in the way weak walls give, crumbling and dusty and apologetic. It gave the way a door gives, suddenly, completely, with a kind of finality that changes the air in the room. And where solid rock should have been, there was instead a darkness that had no business being there. He raised his lamp. The light pushed into the gap and kept going, swallowed by a space far larger than any basement wall had the right to conceal. He could feel it before he could see it. That particular coolness that comes from deep underground, from places that have not breathed open air in a very long time. Most people, at this precise moment, would have done the sensible thing. They would have stepped back, muttered something under their breath, and gone to find someone else to make the decision. But curiosity is a quiet and powerful thing, and it had already made the decision for him. He stepped through. The passage beyond the wall sloped gently downward, its walls smooth in places where human hands had shaped them long ago. It narrowed, then widened again into a chamber, real and deliberate, carved with intention. And from that chamber another corridor reached further into the dark, then another, then a staircase cut directly into the volcanic rock, descending in long, unhurried spirals toward depths he could not yet imagine. He kept going. Archaeologists who arrived in the days and weeks that followed would struggle to find language adequate for what had been uncovered. 18 levels, 60 meters deep, ventilation shafts, still drawing air, stone doors the size of millstones, engineered to roll and seal from the inside. Chapels, kitchens, wells, rooms enough for 20,000 people to vanish into the earth entirely and survive there for months in organized and deliberate silence. 20,000 people beneath a town that had forgotten they were ever there. History had not announced itself with trumpets or excavation teams or the drama of discovery that fills museum placards. It had simply waited, patient and enormous, behind a basement wall in a quiet Anatolian town, until one ordinary man picked up a hammer and gave it the only invitation it needed. Before we descend any further into the darkness, we need to stop and ask the question that changes everything. Because finding an underground city is extraordinary, but understanding why it exists, that is where the story truly begins. Nobody carves 18 levels into the earth on a whim. Nobody relocates 20,000 lives below the surface of the world without a reason so urgent, so desperate, so absolute that the sun itself becomes a luxury they can no longer afford. So who were these people, and what on earth were they running from? To answer that, we need to travel back far back to a land that has never had the comfort of being forgettable. Cappadocia sits at the heart of Anatolia, which is to say it sits at the heart of everything. For thousands of years, this region was not a destination. It was a crossroads. Every empire that ever dreamed of expansion eventually turned its eyes toward this stretch of volcanic plateau, because controlling Anatolia meant controlling the passage between east and west, between the ancient world's greatest powers and its most coveted trade routes. To live here was to live at the center of history's most violent ambitions. The landscape itself seemed to understand this. The volcanic rock of Cappadocia, soft, cooperative, almost generous in the way it yields to tools, had been shaped by eruptions so ancient they belonged to a time before human memory. The result was a terrain unlike anywhere else on Earth. Tall columns of rock called fairy chimneys rose from the ground in their hundreds. The soil could be carved with relative ease, and yet once exposed to air, it hardened into something close to stone. Nature almost accidentally had provided the perfect building material for people who needed to disappear. The earliest evidence of underground dwelling in this region stretches back perhaps 4,000 years to the Hittites, one of the ancient world's great and often underestimated civilizations. The Hittites understood Cappadocia's potential not just as homeland or territory, but as shelter. They began carving. Simple at first, shallow caves, modest extensions of natural formations, places to store grain or retreat during raids. But the idea, once planted, never quite left the soil. Each generation that followed found the tunnels already there, already useful, already waiting to be made deeper. And there were always reasons to go deeper. What made Derinkuyu remarkable? What separated it from a simple cave system or a modest refuge was the scale of its ambition. This was not a place designed for short emergencies. The ventilation shafts, some plunging more than 50 meters, were engineered to supply fresh air to every level simultaneously, a feat of practical genius that modern engineers still examine with genuine admiration. The wells were dug deep enough to provide water entirely independent of the surface, so that a community sealed underground could survive indefinitely, without ever opening a single door to the world above. Indefinitely. That word deserves a moment of stillness. These were not people planning for a bad week. They were planning for the worst version of the world they could imagine, and then engineering their way through it. The city was not built in a single generation. It grew slowly, over centuries, each era adding new rooms and new levels as new threats arrived above ground, and new families needed to be absorbed below it. It was a living structure, expanding with the fear that fed it. And the fear, as we are about to discover, was never in short supply. There is a difference between a place built for comfort and a place built for survival. Comfort is generous. It adds windows, softens edges, invites the light. Survival is precise. It wastes nothing. Every decision it makes is load-bearing. Every detail a calculation between life and death. Derinkuyu was built by people who understood survival the way only the truly hunted can, completely, instinctively, and without the luxury of compromise. And when you walk its corridors today, even through the clean electric light of modern tourism, you can feel that understanding in every carved wall and angled passage. This city was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to be invisible. Begin at the entrance, if you can even find it. That was the first lesson Derinkuyu's architects mastered: concealment. The openings to the underground city were deliberately small, deliberately unremarkable, scattered across the town above, in places easy to miss and easier to disguise. A stone moved aside here, a trapdoor hidden beneath a rug there. Nothing about the surface announced what lay below it. An invading army could march through Derinkuyu streets, ransack its homes, interrogate its silence, and find nothing, because the town they were looking for was not on any map they carried. Once inside, the passages themselves became the first line of defense. The corridors were carved narrow enough that a person must turn sideways in places to move through them comfortably. This was not poor planning. This was genius. A soldier in armor cannot turn sideways without becoming helpless. A group of attackers who breach an entrance find themselves strung out in single file, unable to fight as a unit, unable to swing a weapon with any force. The tunnels transformed every potential invasion into something a defender could manage with a torch and a long enough spear. And then there were the doors, scattered throughout the city's levels, at key intersections and critical passageways, are stone wheels. Each one is enormous, some nearly a meter thick, carved from single pieces of volcanic rock, perfectly circular, and fitted into grooves cut precisely into the tunnel walls. From the outside, these doors are immovable. No amount of force applied from the corridor beyond could shift them, but from the inside, a single person could roll one closed in seconds, sealing off an entire section of the city with the quiet efficiency of turning a key. The doors even had small holes cut through their centers, just large enough to push a spear through, should anyone on the other side grow too curious about what lay beyond. Deeper still, the city expanded into something that defies the imagination of anyone who has only ever thought of underground spaces as cramped and desperate. There were stables on the upper levels, carved with the same care as the human quarters, fitted with stone rings still visible today where animals were tethered. There were communal kitchens with ventilation channels drawn upward through the rock to carry smoke away from the living spaces below, because 20,000 people still needed to eat, and cooking fires still needed somewhere for their breath to go. There were communal dining areas, meeting rooms, spaces that functioned as schools for children who may have spent months of their young lives never once seeing sunlight. There were churches. This detail stops people when they hear it. 60 meters underground, carved into the deepest accessible levels of the city, are chapels with vaulted ceilings and nave structures that echo the architecture of the surface world above. People descending into darkness still needed somewhere to direct their faith, still needed the ritual of gathering, of shared belief, of something larger than the stone walls pressing in around them. The churches of Derinkuyu are not afterthoughts. They are among the most carefully constructed spaces in the entire complex, as if the people who built this city understood that the spirit required shelter just as urgently as the body, and threading through all of it, through every level, every check, amber, every corridor and kitchen and chapel, ran the ventilation shafts. More than 50 of them, some stretching the full 60-meter depth of the city, engineered to create a circulation of air so effective that even today, standing at the lowest accessible level, the air moves, it breathes. The city, abandoned for centuries, still breathes. That single detail, more than any other, communicates the extraordinary minds behind this place. They did not just dig a hole and hide inside it. They built a living system, a machine for human survival, and they built it to last long after the fear that created it had finally, mercifully passed. Every great shelter tells you something about the storm that made it necessary. A raincoat speaks of drizzle, a bunker speaks of bombs, and a city carved 60 meters into the earth, fitted with rolling stone doors and hidden entrances and ventilation systems engineered for indefinite occupation, that speaks of something else entirely. That speaks of a world above ground, so dangerous, so relentlessly threatening, that 20,000 people looked at the sky one day and collectively decided they were better off without it. To understand Derinkuyu fully, you must understand the surface it was hiding from, and the surface for much of this region's history was a place of almost unimaginable violence. Cappadocia's misfortune was its geography. Positioned at the crossroads of 3 continents, it sat directly in the path of every army that ever marched between east and west. Empires did not pass through Cappadocia, they collided there, and the people who called this volcanic plateau home developed, over centuries of hard experience, a particular relationship with the horizon, one of watchfulness, of dread, of the instinctive understanding that what appeared on the edge of the sky was rarely good news. The Hittites had built the first modest underground chambers here, but it was the centuries that followed their collapse that truly drove the excavations deeper. Around 1200 BCE, the ancient world experienced what historians now call the Bronze Age collapse, a cascading series of catastrophes so total and so swift that it erased civilizations across the entire eastern Mediterranean within the space of a few decades. Trade networks dissolved, palaces burned, the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of raiders whose origins are still debated, swept through the region with a ferocity that left almost nothing standing. Cappadocia, sitting exposed at the center of the storm, learned its first hard lesson about what the surface of the world could become when order disappeared. Then came the Persians, the Achaemenid Empire, stretching from modern Iran to the edges of Greece, absorbed Anatolia into its vast machinery in the 6th century BCE. Persian administration brought a degree of stability, PCE, but stability under an empire is a particular kind of insecurity, contingent, fragile, dependent on the mood of a king who lives 1,000 miles away and has never seen your village. When Alexander the Great arrived 2 centuries later and shattered the Persian world, the instability simply changed its uniform. Cappadocia passed between powers like an object of negotiation, its people perpetually subject to the ambitions of rulers who viewed the land as a prize, and its inhabitants as a resource. But it was the arrival of a new and urgent threat in the 7th and 8th centuries CE that most historians believe drove the underground city to its greatest depth and fullest population. The Arab raids that swept through Anatolia during the early Islamic expansion were unlike anything the region had previously endured. They were not conquest in the traditional sense, not the slow administrative absorption of one empire swallowing another. They were fast, seasonal, and devastating. Arab forces would sweep into Cappadocia, strip everything of value, and withdraw before a Byzantine defensive response could be organized. Then they would return the following season and do it again for the Christian communities of Cappadocia, many of them early converts who had made their faith central to their identity. These raids carried an additional terror beyond mere plunder. They threatened the erasure of a way of life, a belief system, a culture that had survived Roman persecution and imperial politics, and every other storm the previous centuries had thrown at it. The underground city became something more than a hiding place. It became a sanctuary in the oldest and most complete sense of the word, a space where everything that mattered could be preserved, while the world above exhausted its worst impulses. The rolling stone doors take on a different weight when you understand this history. They were not architectural flourishes. They were the last line between survival and obliteration, between the quiet breathing of 20,000 people in the dark and the absolute silence that follows when a civilization is extinguished. Every ventilation shaft, every hidden entrance, every narrow corridor designed to neutralize an armored soldier. These were answers to specific questions that history had asked this region repeatedly and without mercy. The enemies at the gate were never abstract. They had faces and languages and weapons, and they came back season after season with the terrible patience of people who believed the land was worth taking. And below them, in the dark, 20,000 people held their breath and waited for the world to remember how to be safe again. There is a question that surfaces quietly, almost shyly, once you have absorbed the scale and engineering of Derinkuyu. On Su you have understood the rolling stone doors and the ventilation shafts and the strategic narrowness of the corridors. Once the architecture of survival has been laid out before you in all its calculated brilliance, the question is this: what was it actually like? Not the engineering, not the history, but the living, the daily, unglamorous, deeply human experience of waking up underground, of raising a child without sunlight, of cooking a meal 60 meters below the world you were born into, and wondering quietly whether today would be the day it was finally safe to go back up. Because Derinkuyu was not a tomb. It was not a monument, or a museum, or a place where people went to die. It was a home, and homes, no matter how strange their circumstances, fill themselves with the texture of ordinary life, with noise and smell and habit, and the small negotiations of people living in close proximity to one another. 20,000 people did not descend into this city and become ghosts. They brought everything with them: their animals, their faith, their arguments, their recipes, their children, their grief, and their stubborn, irreducible will to continue existing. The upper levels of the city were given over to the animals: horses, donkeys, sheep, the livestock that a community depends on for transport and food, and the slow turning of agricultural life. Stone rings carved into the walls of the stables are still visible today, smooth with the memory of tethered animals who spent weeks or months underground alongside their owners. The smell alone requires a moment of imagination. 20,000 people and their animals sharing recycled air in carved rock chambers, sustained by ventilation shafts that performed daily miracles of engineering but could not entirely disguise the reality of what they were keeping alive. This was not comfortable. Nobody pretended it was. The kitchens were communal, practical, and ingenious. Cooking fires were positioned directly beneath ventilation channels so that smoke was drawn upward and away from the living quarters below, preventing the slow suffocation that would otherwise make sustained underground habitation impossible. The food itself would have been primarily what could be stored: grain, dried legumes, preserved meats, oil. The deep wells provided water clean enough to sustain the population indefinitely, their shafts sealed from above to prevent poisoning by any enemy resourceful enough to find an opening. Meals would have been simple, repetitive, and enormously important, not just as nutrition, but as ritual, as the daily reassurance that life was still organized, still proceeding, still worth the effort of preparation. Children grew up in these corridors. This is perhaps the detail that settles most heavily on the imagination. Children who were born underground or brought below as infants, who learned to walk in carved stone passages and played in chambers lit by oil lamps, whose light flickered against walls, smoothed by generations of hands. Their entire understanding of space would have been shaped by enclosure, by ceilings just above reach, by corridors that turned and narrowed, by the particular acoustic quality of sound in underground rooms where voices carry differently and footsteps echo with a hollow patience. What did they imagine the surface world to be during the long weeks when the stone doors were sealed and the world above was something their parents spoke about in careful, quiet tones? Faith sustained them in ways that practical engineering could not. The churches carved into the deepest levels of the city were not merely architectural coincidences. They were the community's insistence that meaning survived even here, that the rituals of gathering and prayer and shared bell I fist did not require sunlight or open sky to remain valid. Services would have been held by lamplight, voices rising in stone-vaulted spaces, that amplified sound in ways that must have felt to the people inside them like something close to holy. The church was where 20,000 people reminded themselves regularly and collectively that their current circumstances were temporary and that something larger than fear was organizing their existence. And then there were the quieter moments, the ones history never quite captures but which were as real as any battle or architectural achievement. A mother telling a story to a child too frightened to sleep. Two old men arguing in low voices about something entirely unrelated to survival. A young person sitting alone at the edge of a ventilation shaft, feeling the air move against their face and closing their eyes and pretending, just for a moment, that it was wind. Every story that begins with people has to reckon, eventually, with their absence, because at some point, and the historical record is frustratingly imprecise, about exactly when the fires in Derinkuyu's kitchens went cold. The stone doors were rolled back and left open. The ventilation shafts continued their patient breathing, but there was no longer anyone below to receive the air they carried. The animals were led back up into the light. The children who had learned to walk in carved corridors were carried or coaxed upward through passages that had defined the boundaries of their entire world. And the city, level by level, chamber by chamber, corridor by corridor, emptied itself into a silence so complete and so enduring that centuries would pass before another human voice disturbed it. The question of when Derinkuyu was finally abandoned is one that historians and archaeologists continue to examine with the careful frustration of people trying to read a day, a comment that was never meant to be read. There is no single dramatic moment on record, no decree, no catastrophe, no clear historical pivot point where the underground city appears in the narrative and then disappears from it. What we have instead are fragments. Archaeological evidence suggests the city was in active use as late as the Byzantine period, which stretches into the medieval era. Some accounts reference underground refuges in Cappadocia during the Mongol invasions of the 13th and 14th centuries, when the armies of first Genghis Khan and later Timur swept through Anatolia with a devastation that made even the Arab raids of earlier centuries seem almost measured by comparison. The Mongols deserve a moment of acknowledgement here, because their arrival represented something qualitatively different from the threats that had preceded it. Previous invaders, the Persians, the Arab raiders, the various Byzantine rivals, operated within a recognizable framework of territorial ambition. They wanted land, resources, submission. The Mongol campaigns, particularly in their early phases, operated on a different logic entirely. One of such comprehensive destruction that entire cities were erased from the map, not as a side effect of conquest, but as its primary purpose. For the communities of Cappadocia, who had by this point spent centuries refining their underground survival systems, the Mongol threat would have felt like the fulfillment of every fear the city had ever been built to answer. And yet, even after the Mongols passed, the city was not immediately abandoned. The Ottoman Empire absorbed Anatolia in the 15th century, and under Ottoman rule the region experienced a degree of stability it had not known for generations. The existential threats that had made underground living necessary began, slowly and unevenly, to recede. The surface world became, if not entirely safe, at least navigable in ways it had not previously been. And people, given the choice between a carved rock chamber 60 meters underground and a house with windows and a view of the sky, will generally choose the souse. But the abandonment was almost certainly not total or immediate. Communities do not surrender survival infrastructure overnight, especially communities whose collective memory stretches back centuries of hard experience. The city was more likely emptied gradually, First, the deepest levels, then the middle ones, as families and groups made individual calculations about the balance between risk and comfort and decided one by one that the surface had become safe enough to trust again. The upper levels closest to the world above were probably the last to be relinquished, used perhaps for storage long after the lower chambers had been sealed and forgotten. What was left behind tells its own quiet story. Archaeologists working through the city's chambers found the remnants of daily life, pottery fragments, stone tools, evidence of cooking fires, the worn smoothness of floors travelled by thousands of feet over hundreds of years. They did not find evidence of sudden departure or catastrophic event, no signs of violence within the city itself, no indication that the population was driven out rather than choosing to leave. Derinkuyu was not abandoned in panic. It was relinquished carefully and gradually by people who had decided that the long emergency was finally, provisionally over. And then the forgetting began, not all at once. The people who had lived there carried the knowledge of its existence with them, passed it to their children as local history, as the story of what their grandparents had survived. But knowledge without use grows soft at the edges. Generations accumulated above the empty city, each one a little far, rather removed from the urgency that had made it necessary. The entrances were covered, disguised, forgotten, the corridors filled with dust and silence. The stone doors stood open in the dark, waiting for a crisis that stopped coming. And the city that had sheltered 20,000 lives settled into the long, patient sleep of things that history has finished with, waiting without knowing it was waiting for a man with a hammer and a modest ambition for more storage space to wake it up again. There is a particular kind of legacy that belongs only to things that survive by disappearing. Derinkuyu did not endure because it was celebrated or protected or written into the official record of great human achievements. It endured because it was forgotten so completely that nothing could disturb it. The armies that had driven 20,000 people underground eventually crumbled into their own histories. The empires that had made the surface world so dangerous dissolved into museums and archaeology and the dry language of academic papers. And below all of it, sealed in volcanic rock and patient silence, the city simply continued to exist, unchanged, unhurried, indifferent to the centuries accumulating above it, like layers of snow over something that does not feel the cold. When Derinkuyu was officially opened to the public in 1969, 6 years after that first hammer swing broke through a basement wall, the world received it with the particular mixture of wonder and unease that genuinely extraordinary discoveries tend to produce. Here was proof, physical, walkable, undeniable proof that human beings, when sufficiently threatened, are capable of engineering miracles that redefine what we think survival looks like. Tourists descended into the carved corridors and emerged changed in small but real ways, carrying with them a new understanding of what ordinary people are capable of when the world above them becomes impossible to inhabit. The archaeologists who have spent decades studying Derinkuyu will tell you carefully and with appropriate academic caution that they still do not know everything. The city has been partially mapped, partially explored, partially understood, but the volcanic plateau of Cappadocia is vast, and the rock is generous, and the people who carved these tunnels were thorough in ways that continue to surprise researchers. In 2013, demolition work in the nearby city of Nevşehir uncovered evidence of another underground complex, potentially larger than Derinkuyu itself, stretching beneath a Byzantine castle and the surrounding hillside in dimensions that have not yet been fully determined. The excavations are ongoing. The earth is still yielding its secrets with the slow, unhurried generosity of something that has been holding them for a very long time. This is the detail that tends to settle on people most heavily when they encounter the full scope of Cappadocia's underground world. not just that one city exists, but that the region may contain dozens of them in various states of discovery and undiscovery scattered beneath a landscape that looks from above like nothing more than beautiful and unusual rock formations. There are approximately 200 known underground spaces in Cappadocia. 200. And known is doing considerable work in that sentence, because known simply means that someone has found an entrance. It says nothing about what lies beyond it, how deep it goes, or how long it has been waiting. What Derinkuyu ultimately teaches us is something that feels both ancient and urgently contemporary. It teaches us that the impulse to protect what matters, family, faith, community, the ordinary texture of daily life, is powerful enough to move mountains, or in this case, to hollow them out entire. The people who built this city, were not exceptional in the ways we usually celebrate. They were not conquerors or emperors or visionaries who shaped the world according to grand ambitions. They were ordinary people in impossible circumstances who looked at the ground beneath their feet and saw, instead of an ending, a way through. They picked up their tools and they went to work. And they built something that has outlasted every enemy that ever drove them underground. There is resilience in that story, but there is also something more uncomfortable. A reminder that the conditions which produce underground cities are not as distant from the present as we might prefer to believe. People still flee. People still hide. People still hide. People still make desperate calculations about where safety can be found when the surface world turns hostile. Derinkuyu is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a monument to a particular kind of human experience that has never entirely gone away, only changed its geography and its circumstances. And perhaps most unsettling of all, most quietly, persistently unsettling, is the simple possibility that we have not yet found everything, that somewhere beneath an unremarkable stretch of Anatolian plateau, beneath the foundations of a town whose residents go about their ordinary lives without suspicion or curiosity, there is a darkness that has not yet been interrupted, corridors that have not felt footsteps in 5 centuries, stone doors still rolled closed from the inside by hands that are long gone. Chambers where the air still moves through ventilation shafts engineered by people whose names we will never know. For a world that no longer exists, in a silence so deep and so complete that it has become, over the long centuries, indistinguishable from peace. All it needs is someone with a hammer